9:17 a.m. on December 7, 1941. As the second wave of aircraft vanished into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, certain that every variable had been solved. 11 months of planning, every contingency gamed, every ship in the American fleet counted down to the last destroyer, every patrol pattern traced from memory. Yet one staggering, invisible number was catastrophically wrong, and that single error would decide the outcome of the Pacific War before the first American shot was fired. He wasn't alone in the mistake. An entire intelligence apparatus, meticulous, disciplined, and confident, had misread the enemy by a factor of more than 7 to 1. The result wasn't merely a bad estimate. It was a strategic delusion. Tokyo's high command projected that by December 1943, the United States Navy would field 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The reality on that date, 279 officers, 472 officer candidates, and 2,034 enlisted personnel, a mobilization that shattered Japanese assumptions. This wasn't a rounding error, it was a fundamental failure to understand what the United States was capable of when fully aroused. The first tremor came from a quiet observer, Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa, a gifted aviator turned intelligence analyst after illness grounded his flying career. On March 27, 1941, under the alias Tadashi Morimura, he arrived in Honolulu under diplomatic cover to map the pulse of America's Pacific Fleet. He rode tourist boats through Pearl Harbor. He rented small aircraft to photograph installations. He memorized patrol tempos and counted hulls and aircraft. His reports were thorough, precise, and ultimately misread. The flaw wasn't in Yoshikawa's eyes. It was in Tokyo's lens. Planners treated American ships as if they were Japanese ships. Lean crews, maximum efficiency, minimal personnel. They assumed comparable manning, comparable training pipelines, comparable doctrine. They were wrong on every count that mattered. Inside Tokyo, intelligence was a secondary branch. Less prestige, fewer billets, minimal clout. Operations ruled. Analysis served. Reports that challenged established plans were footnoted and filed. Ambitious officers avoided intelligence assignments, and the culture privileged decisive offensive action over uncomfortable caution. In that environment, even accurate collection could not overcome organizational bias. Captain Toshikazu Ome and his colleagues in long-range planning modeled American capacity using Japanese mobilization patterns, careful growth, tight standards, no mass reserve influx. Their calculus concluded the U.S. could sustain roughly 40 major combatants in the Pacific with limited ability to run simultaneous campaigns. That assumption, embedded into the strategy to seize Southeast Asian resources, build a perimeter from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, and force a negotiated peace, was the scaffolding of Japan's war. It rested on sand. This was mirror imaging at scale, assuming the adversary thinks and mobilizes as you do. The Imperial Navy prized elite, tightly selected crews. Reserves were marginal. Training was long and exacting. Wartime expansion from roughly 120,000 to 300,000 naval personnel felt enormous, a tripling over 4 years, but America operated on a different planet. In June 1941, the U.S. Navy counted about 284,000 active duty personnel. 18 months later, in December 1942, it was 1,640,000. By December 1943, 2,274,94. The curve wasn't linear, it was exponential. Training bases multiplied, recruitment surged, and an entire continental economy vaulted into war footing. The Japanese had studied shipyards and knew American hulls would arrive fast. What they failed to grasp was that the crews would arrive even faster. Population mattered. The United States in 1941 held 131 million people, with a vast pool of men of military age and fewer social constraints on service. Japan drew from 73 million, bounded by stricter class, education, and gender limitations. The math wasn't subtle, but analysis isn't about what should be obvious. It's about what you're prepared to see. Battle of the Coral Sea, May 1942. Reconnaissance reported 2 American carriers. Japanese doctrine implied roughly 2,000 personnel per fleet carrier, so about 4,000 sailors in action. Yet radio intercepts hinted at multiple task groups, robust logistics, oversized screens, 7,000, 9,000 personnel for the same footprint. The discrepancy suggested higher U.S. manning levels. It was logged and rationalized away as inefficiency. Midway, June 1942. Disaster for Japan. 4 carriers lost. But the shock inside intelligence was damage control. Yorktown absorbed bomb and torpedo hits that should have doomed her. Within hours, power was restored. Deck holes were plated, and she limped back into flight operations. Captured crew lists later showed 2,200 plus names, a 50% Manning Delta versus Japanese assumptions for a comparable carrier. That wasn't redundancy. It was resilience by design. More hands for damage control, maintenance, flight ops, everything. Still, Tokyo did not revise the master numbers. Guadalcanal, August 1942. Tokyo predicted an American landing of 8,000, 10,000 troops. The Marines put 11,000 on Guadalcanal alone, with parallel landings on Tulagi and nearby islands, 16,000 plus total. Covering naval forces included 3 carriers, a battleship, 14 cruisers, 31 destroyers, and a logistics train that pulsed across the ocean while Atlantic convoys continued unabated. Submarines counted a torrent of transports crewed by rapidly trained merchant mariners. Either America had cracked the laws of arithmetic, or Japanese estimates were broken. Headquarters chose arithmetic's failure. By early 1943, field reports were irreconcilable with pre-war projections. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Harvard alumnus and former Washington attaché, sent a blunt cable. The Pacific order of battle could not be explained by existing estimates. If the Atlantic wasn't being stripped bare, then the numbers were wrong. Fundamentally, investigate, recompute. Analysts pulled 18 months of raw reporting, submarine sightings, reconnaissance, radio call sign networks, POW interrogations, captured manuals, training base mentions, shore establishment growth. Initial tallies put U.S. naval personnel over 850,000 in visible operations. Applying documented American manning standards to observed ships raised the figure to around $1,200,000, and that excluded recruits in boot camp, technical schools, and much of the vast shore infrastructure. The memo's conclusion: Japan was off by at least 3.1, likely 4.1 or more, landed on senior desks and hit cultural bedrock. Could anyone really train hundreds of thousands in months? In Tokyo's frame, competence took years. Cohesion required time. The idea that America could field effective mass forces so quickly collided with everything the Imperial Navy believed about creating sailors. In July 1943, a captured American radio man, his destroyer sunk off Kolombangara, described boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois. 4,000 recruits in his company, 20,000 new sailors per month through that one facility's pipeline. 8 weeks per cycle. He mentioned 3 other major centers with similar throughput. At scale, that meant close to 1 million sailors per year entering the system, when combined with officer schools and technical ratings. The interrogator asked him to repeat the numbers. Certain translation had failed. It hadn't. Skepticism lingered until a German U-boat report arrived in September 1943. After shadowing an Atlantic convoy, the commander estimated American destroyer escorts carried about 180-200 crew, compared to 120 on roughly comparable Japanese hulls. The Germans flagged it as a tactical curiosity. For Japanese analysts, it was the missing confirmation. The U.S. Navy was manned heavier across the board. Escorts, cruisers, battleships, carriers. Every American ship type implied more people. More capability, more depth. A special working group in naval intelligence was tasked to start over. No sacred assumptions. 6 weeks of forensic counting produced a report on November 9th, 1943. U.S. naval personnel, approximately 1,800,000 mid-43, projecting 2,400,000 by mid-44. Conservative, yet close enough that the strategic implications were undeniable. With that manpower, America could run major fleets in multiple theaters simultaneously, sustain losses Japan could never replace, keep Atlantic convoys at full strength, while offensive operations surged in the Central and Southwest Pacific, and garrison islands with permanent crews. The perimeter strategy, premised on an opponent who could not attack everywhere at once, was obsolete. The quick war, followed by negotiation, dissolved under the weight of a nation that didn't run out of people. The conclusion was stark. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. Numbers had rendered victory mathematically impossible. The report went to Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada and a handful of senior officers. The math held. The methods held. The implications did not. Circulating it widely risked morale collapse at the front and political crisis at home. If the emperor learned that war had been launched on numbers wrong by 7 or 8 to 1, the chain of command itself might be consumed. So the truth was classified at the highest level, distribution limited to fewer than 20. Internal planning documents were quietly updated. Field commanders were not told. They would go on planning as if America were near its manpower ceiling. It wasn't. By December 1943, actual U.S. naval strength stood at 2,374,094. Tokyo's estimate had been 296,000. This was not a collection failure. The data existed: POW accounts of training pipelines, intercepted call signs and unit structures, visible convoys, open-source industrial statistics, technical journals. The failure was analytical and institutional, a culture that couldn't accept what it didn't expect to see. In 1944, the Pacific filled with parallel offensives, the Marshalls and Marianas in the Central Pacific, New Guinea in the Southwest, operations across the CBI theater, all while the Atlantic ran at full escort strength and Europe absorbed its own amphibious storms. American task forces seemed to multiply under fire. Destroy one, two more materialized. Lose 12 destroyers. 20 arrived next month. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the U.S. sailed with 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 20 destroyers, about 70,000 personnel in a single task force. In December 1941, the entire Imperial Navy counted under 400,000 across all functions. Japan lost 3 carriers and around 450 aircraft in that battle. The U.S. lost 29 aircraft and resumed full operations within hours. That was what unlimited depth looked like. Trained replacements in the pipeline, maintenance capacity measured in continents, logistics measured in oceans. Some argued Japan had no choice. The oil embargo forced action. Perhaps war was inevitable, but how the war was fought was not. With accurate estimates showing a 10.1 personnel advantage in the enemy's favor, Japan might have narrowed objectives, prioritized defense, or sought negotiation earlier. Instead, leaders clung to the belief that America would tire and bargain. That belief was born of mirror imaging and hardened by institutional denial. Commander Chikataka Nakajima, who synthesized intelligence and operational lessons throughout the war, later described the core problem to American interrogators. Intelligence was understaffed, undervalued, and structurally unable to challenge operational dogma. When analysis contradicted plans, plans won. Shimada, tried as a Class A war criminal after surrender, later spoke of fighting with honor against unforeseeable odds. Honor, yes. Unforeseeable, no. The odds were foreseen, then sealed, because acknowledging them threatened the system itself. Japan began the war with roughly 120,000 naval personnel. It peaked near 300,000. The United States began with about 337,000. By August 1945, it exceeded 3,180,000, a tenfold expansion in under 4 years. America trained and deployed more sailors in 1944 alone than Japan possessed at peak wartime strength. More ships than Japan could build. More aircraft than Japan could manufacture. More supply pushed farther, faster, longer than Japan could imagine sustaining. Tokyo's estimate for December 1943, 296,000 American sailors, faced an actual total of 2,034,343 enlisted, 124,72 officer candidates and 219,279 officers. That gap, assumption versus reality, is the whole story in a single breath. The numbers were never hidden. They were in American trade journals, census tables, industrial reports. What was missing wasn't data. It was the willingness to see an enemy that mobilized by different rules, at a different scale, with different limits. Intelligence finally discovered the truth in late 1943, and then buried it. The war machine rolled on, powered by a fiction that had already failed. Wars are lost when you misjudge what your enemy can bring to the fight. Japan looked in a mirror and mistook the reflection for the United States. The real America was bigger, faster, and organizationally relentless. In the end, it wasn't that American sailors were always better, though often they were. It was that there were so many more of them, sustained by an industrial society designed to scale. 6,000 estimated. WWII-374 WWII-94 actual. Before Akagi's planes darkened Pearl Harbor's sky, the math had already decided the fate of an empire. If this story gripped you, like the video, subscribe for more untold chapters of World War II, and tell us where you're watching from. Texas to Tasmania, veterans to history buffs, every memory matters, every lesson endures.